Marshall Hargrove had always considered himself a predictable man. In his 37 years, he had a steady job as an office equipment repair technician for Technic Solutions, a small house with a neat garden in a quiet Havenport neighborhood, and a 12-year marriage to Cecilia that looked exemplary from the outside. Every morning, Marshall woke up at 6:30, showered, drank a cup of strong coffee, and ate the oatmeal Cecilia had prepared the night before going to her job in the accounting department of the local clinic. By 7:30, he was already in his pickup truck, ready to take the route his dispatcher, Gwen, had sent to the company phone, set up copiers and troubleshoot office communication systems throughout Havenport. He was valued for his punctuality, reliability, and ability to fix almost any device. Golden hands and iron logic, his boss, Fred Palmer, said of him whenever a particularly challenging assignment came up. Evenings at the Hargrove home also followed a set routine. Cecilia cooked dinner, they exchanged the news of the day in front of the television, and sometimes they called their parents. On weekends, Marshall worked in the garden or tinkered with the car, while Cecilia met with friends or went shopping. It seemed as if this measured course of life would go on forever, gradually turning into a quiet old age with grandchildren and trips to the sea for holidays. They had no children. After several years of trying and a couple of visits to specialists, they somehow tacitly agreed that perhaps it was for the best. In this decision, as with so much else in their marriage, there were no loud fights or stormy reconciliations, just a quiet acceptance of the circumstances and a willingness to move on within the given framework. Marshall's only whim was an old cabin in the mountains, 3 hours' drive from Havenport. He'd inherited it from his Uncle Ted, who'd bought the property in the 80s, dreaming of fishing and hunting, but who'd never had time to fix it up. Marshall was rarely there, either 2 or 3 times a year, usually alone, because Cecilia had never shared his love of abandoned mountain trails and nights under the stars. "Do you realize we're paying taxes for a pile of logs in the middle of nowhere?" she'd say when Marshall mentioned having to drive out there to check the condition of the roof or fix a creaky porch. But for him, the place was linked to childhood memories of rare trips with his father and uncle, to a sense of freedom and peace he'd never found anywhere else. On that evening in late April, nothing heralded change. Spring was in full swing in Havenport. The apple trees in the orchard were in full bloom, and Marshall, returning from work earlier than usual, had decided to work on the property. He was just finishing trimming the lilac bushes when he heard Cecilia's car pull up. It was about 6 in the evening and the sun was still high, casting a golden light on the garden. Cecilia got out of the car wearing a new dress, a dark blue dress with a small floral print. Marshall noticed that she looked unusual, her hair more carefully styled than usual, lipstick on her lips, which she rarely used on weekdays. "A meeting of some sort?" he asked as she stepped closer. Cecilia shook her head. She looked tense, avoiding meeting his gaze. "Marshall, we need to talk," she said quietly, but firmly. He knew that tone. It was the way she spoke when she'd made an important decision and wasn't going to back down from it. It had been that way when she'd insisted on moving away from his parents, when she'd decided to change jobs, when she'd announced she no longer wanted to see doctors about infertility. "Sure." Marshall stuck the garden shears in the ground and wiped his hands on his jeans. "Is something wrong?" Cecilia sat down on the bench under the apple tree, their favorite place for evening conversations in the warm weather. Marshall sat down next to her, feeling the anxiety building with each passing second. "I don't know how to say this," she began, looking at her hands. "You and I have been together for so many years, but I think we both know that things between us haven't been what they should be between husband and wife for a long time." Marshall frowned. "What do you mean? We're fine." Cecilia finally looked up. There was a mixture of determination and regret in her eyes. "No, Marshall, we're not okay. We just exist side by side, like roommates. When was the last time you asked me not what's for dinner, but how I was feeling? When was the last time we had a real conversation or were intimate? Marshall wanted to object, but the words stuck in his throat. They really hadn't been close in a while. He couldn't even remember how long it had been. Months? A year? I met a man, Cecilia continued after a pause. His name is Elliot. He works in hospital administration. We started chatting about work and then, I didn't plan it, Marshall. I swear I wasn't looking for this. But he makes me feel alive. He sees me, not as part of the environment, but as a person with feelings, desires. You and I lost that long ago, without even noticing. Marshall stared at her, trying to make sense of what he'd heard. Part of him wanted to scream, to accuse her of betrayal, but somewhere deep inside he knew that Cecilia was right. Their marriage had long ago become a mechanical coexistence with no room for passion or real intimacy. Have you had an affair before? He asked quietly. Cecilia shook her head. No. I mean, we kissed once, but I stopped it. I didn't want to deceive you, Marshall. That's why I'm here now, talking to you. I want a divorce. The last word sounded like a gunshot. Marshall felt the ground go from under his feet. A divorce? Cecilia, that's too much. Maybe we should try to fix things first. See a counselor. I've thought about that, she replied. But honestly, I don't see the point. You and I have been living parallel lives for a long time. I don't blame you, Marshall. You're a good person. We're just not right for each other anymore. And I don't want to spend more years pretending everything's okay. Marshall sat looking out at the blooming garden, which now seemed somehow unreal, like a stage set for someone else's life. You've already made up your mind, haven't you? Cecilia nodded. I'll stay with my sister for a few days. Give you time to think. But I'm not changing my mind, Marshall. I think you'll be better off in the end, too. You'll be able to find someone to love you the way you deserve. She stood up and Marshall automatically rose to follow her. I'll pack, Cecilia said. Just the essentials. I'll come back for the rest later. Marshall nodded, unable to find the words. He stood in the garden watching his wife go into the house and tried to comprehend how his familiar, settled world had just fallen apart. That night, Marshall hardly slept at all. Cecilia left around 9 p.m., taking a small suitcase full of belongings. Her goodbye was short and awkward. She hugged him, said, "I'm sorry," and left. He sat in the kitchen until late at night, staring at the wall and trying to imagine what would happen next. In the morning, Marshall woke up on the couch, where he'd moved around 3 in the morning when he realized he couldn't sleep in their shared bed. His head was buzzing with sleep deprivation and thoughts. He got up, went to the bathroom, and only there did he notice the first signs of change. Cecilia's toothbrush, her favorite face lotion, and her makeup bag were gone. With growing anxiety, he went to the bedroom and opened the closet. Half of her things were gone, not just the ones Cecilia had picked up the evening before in a small suitcase. All her dresses, blouses, shoes, all gone. There was a stack of papers on the bedside table, a note on top. I asked Laura to pick up my things while you slept. I'm sorry for this way, but I thought it would be easier for both of us. Talk to a lawyer, please. I've already signed everything. Marshall sank down on the bed and picked up the papers. They were divorce papers, filled out and signed by Cecilia. She'd obviously prepared them in advance, long before last night's conversation. And judging by the fact that her sister had managed to get all of her things early in the morning, the plan had been carefully thought out. His 12-year marriage was ending, not with an explosion, but with the quiet whisper of sheets of paper in an empty bedroom. Marshall sat staring at the wall, at the picture of their wedding where they were both smiling, surrounded by friends and family. Everything had seemed so clear and right then. When had things changed? And how could he not have noticed it? He dialed Fred's number and took a day off work for the first time in 8 years. Then he called his old friend Vince, who worked at the law firm. I need a good divorce lawyer, Marshall said, surprised at the calmness in his own voice. He spent the entire day in a kind of daze, as if observing his life from the outside. It wasn't until the evening, when he automatically pulled out 2 dinner plates in the kitchen, that the reality of what was happening hit him hard, and Marshall felt tears streaming down his cheeks for the first time in years. 2 weeks later, Marshall sat in the reception area of Everett and Associates, nervously tapping his fingers on his knee. After that first shocking day, it was as if he'd been functioning on autopilot, back at work, mechanically going about his daily routine, answering calls from worried relatives. Yes, Cecilia and I are getting a divorce. No, nothing can be fixed. Yes, I'm fine. The last was a lie, but Marshall repeated those words so often that he almost believed them himself. The lawyer Vince had referred him to didn't look like a typical lawyer from a TV show. No aggressive 3-piece suit or predatory facial expression. Nolan Everett was a thin man of about 50, with a streak in his dark hair and a calm, thoughtful gaze behind his thin-rimmed glasses. He shook Marshall's hand and gestured to his office. "So, Mr. Hargrove, I've reviewed the documents you passed on through Vincent," Everett said as they settled at the desk. "I must say, your wife has made some pretty generous terms." Marshall nodded. After rereading the documents several times, he'd come to the same conclusion. Cecilia had no claim to the house, agreed to an equal division of jointly acquired property and bank accounts. She even waived her right to alimony, even though her salary was less. "There's just one point that struck me as odd," the attorney continued, flipping through the pages. "It says here that you retain full title to a piece of land with a cabin in Pine Ridge County, but I don't see any compensation in favor of your spouse." "Cecilia never liked that cabin," Marshall explained. "Considered it a useless waste of money. I think she's just glad to be rid of having to pay the land tax." Everett tapped his pen thoughtfully on the papers. "And when was the last time you were on this property, Mr. Hargrove?" "Last year, I guess," Marshall shrugged. "Maybe 10 months ago. Why?" The lawyer leaned back in his chair. "And you haven't heard of any plans to develop the land in that neighborhood?" Marshall frowned. "No, why? What's going on?" Everett pulled out a clipboard, flipped through something on the screen, and turned it toward Marshall. "Here's an article from the business section of the local paper, published 2 months ago. Summit Resorts has gotten approval to build a ski resort in northern Pine Ridge County, a $120 million project. They've already started buying up land within a 5-mile radius of the future resort." Marshall looked at the screen. The article was titled, "New Ski Resort Will Turn Pine Ridge into a Tourist Mecca." The map marked an area that looked suspiciously familiar. "Mr. Hargrove," Everett said softly, "I believe your cabin is right in the center of their area of interest, and if the information is correct, your lot could be worth about $10 million. Marshall stared at the lawyer, unable to believe his ears. $10 million? For a rundown place in the mountains? "For 20 acres of land in a strategically important location," Everett corrected. "Are you sure your wife didn't know that when she drew up the divorce papers?" Marshall's thoughts raced feverishly. Cecilia worked at the hospital. Elliot, what was he? Her lover. He worked in administration at the same hospital. Could he have known about the resort's plans? Could they have conspired to make sure Cecilia got most of their joint property and left Marshall the useless cabin without mentioning its true value? But then he remembered how annoyed Cecilia had always been about the maintenance bills on the cabin, how she had never wanted to go there. It was hard to imagine that she knew the value of the land and had given it up so easily. "I guess she didn't know," Marshall finally said. "But what does that mean for our divorce?" "In theory, you are required to disclose all assets in a divorce," Everett explained. "But in this case, you yourself were unaware of the potential value of the property. Plus, Mrs. Hargrove drew up those documents herself and gave up her rights to the cabin. The court would likely approve such an agreement. Marshall was silent, trying to comprehend the sudden turn of events. 2 weeks ago, he had a wife and a normal life. Now he had no wife, but perhaps a $10 million piece of land. "What am I going to do?" he finally asked. "I would recommend hiring an appraiser to accurately determine the value of the lot," Everett said, "and perhaps get a real estate professional to help with a potential sale. But we need to finalize the divorce proceedings first." There was a knock on the door, and a young woman entered the office with a clipboard in hand. She had red hair gathered into a careless bun and bright green eyes behind the panes of her black-rimmed glasses. "Sorry for the interruption, Mr. Everett," she said, "but you're requested on a conference call in 5 minutes." "Thank you, Fiona," the lawyer nodded. "Meet Miss Fiona Murphy, my indispensable assistant. Fiona, this is Mr. Marshall Hargrove, our new client." The woman smiled and shook Marshall's hand. "Pleased to meet you, Mr. Hargrove." "Fiona was just recently on a case involving Summit Resorts," Everett remarked. "She will probably be able to tell you more about the prospects of your site." "I can look into it while you're on the call," Fiona offered, "if Mr. Hargrove doesn't mind." Marshall nodded, feeling like he was in a strange dream. "I don't mind." When Everett walked out, Fiona sat down across from Marshall and opened some files on her tablet. "So, where exactly is your precinct located?" They spent the next hour looking at maps and documents. Fiona proved to be not only friendly, but incredibly competent. She went into every detail, asked precise questions, and wrote down information with astonishing speed. "Based on these coordinates," she zoomed in on the screen, "your plot is right here. And yes, it's right in the center of the area that Summit plans to turn into a resort. In fact, their preliminary plans call for one of the main cable cars to run through here." "I can't believe it," Marshall muttered. "This piece of land has always been a family joke. My Uncle Ted bought it for next to nothing because the neighborhood was considered too remote and inconvenient to build on." "Real estate is always a matter of time and place," Fiona observed philosophically. "A useless plot today and a gold mine tomorrow, but you're lucky your wife didn't know that." Marshall sighed. "I'm not sure it's luck. Cecilia deserves to know." "May I be frank?" Fiona interrupted him. "Your wife left you for another man and filed for divorce without even attempting to discuss the problems in the marriage. She doesn't deserve a fraction of the sudden wealth that has descended on you." Marshall looked at her in surprise. "You and I just met. What makes you jump to such conclusions?" Fiona blushed slightly. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. It's just, I went through a painful divorce myself 2 years ago, and because of infidelity too. But unlike you, I had to fight for every dime, so maybe I'm projecting my experience too much." Her candor buoyed Marshall. "It's nothing. It's just that this is all so unexpected." "I understand," Fiona nodded. "But if you'll allow me to offer some advice, don't feel guilty about it. Take the opportunity to start a new chapter in your life." Their conversation was interrupted by Everett returning. They discussed the next steps. Everett suggested expediting the divorce as much as possible before news of the resort became public, and Fiona promised to contact several real estate appraisers and inquire about potential offers from Summit Resorts. When the meeting was over, Marshall felt both exhausted and strangely elated. As he left the building, he heard Fiona's voice behind him. "Mr. Hargrove, you forgot your cell phone." She caught up with him on the street, holding out the cell phone forgotten on the table. "Thank you," he said, accepting the device. "And please call me Marshall." "Okay, Marshall," she smiled. "We'll be in touch." Walking back home, Marshall realized that for the first time in 2 weeks, he wasn't thinking about Cecilia and her betrayal. Instead, his thoughts were occupied with plans for the future, and for some reason Fiona Murphy's smile. The next 2 weeks flew by in a whirlwind of events. An appraiser hired by Everett confirmed the phenomenal value of the property $8 to $12 million, depending on the negotiating position. Through a realtor specializing in commercial real estate, they received a preliminary inquiry from Summit Resorts with an offer of $8 million. "We can get more," Fiona said confidently as the three of them discussed the offer in Everett's office. "They know your site is critical to their project. It's like the last piece of the puzzle. Without it, the whole picture doesn't come together." Marshall nodded, marveling at his own calm. A month ago, he'd been an ordinary technician with an annual income of just over $50,000. Now he was discussing multi-million-dollar deals as if he'd been in business all his life. "What are you offering?" he asked, looking at Fiona. "Let's ask for 15 and be willing to settle for 12, she answered without hesitation. "The Summit has the money, and they're in a hurry to start construction before the end of the year." Nolan Everett nodded approvingly. "I agree with Fiona. Besides, the divorce proceedings are moving along smoothly. The judge should approve the settlement next week." "And Cecilia? Has she learned anything about the resort?" Marshall asked. "Not that we know of," replied Everett. "Her attorney hasn't made any new demands. I guess she really doesn't know the value of the property." Marshall felt a prick of conscience. On the one hand, he was under no obligation to disclose information he himself did not possess at the time the documents were drawn up. On the other hand, 12 years of marriage, didn't that deserve at least an honest conversation? As if reading his thoughts, Fiona said softly, "Marshall, she made her choice. She went to another man and clearly had no qualms about leaving you." "You're right," he sighed. "It's just that it all seems so unreal." "Life often holds surprises," Everett said philosophically. "Sometimes bad, sometimes good. It's how we respond to them that matters." After that meeting, Marshall and Fiona began communicating more frequently. At first, their conversations were all business-related. She would call to update on the progress of negotiations with Summit or to ask her to sign some documents. But gradually, they began to discuss other topics. He told her about his work, about the cabin, about his childhood memories connected with this place. She shared the story of her failed marriage to an artist who found a muse in the person of a gallery owner, and how, after the divorce, she decided to change her career from a literature teacher to a legal assistant. "It was a way to take control of my life," she explained during their impromptu dinner at an Italian restaurant near Everett's office. "I felt like a victim of circumstance all the time, and now I help people out of difficult situations every day." Marshall looked at her across the candlelit table and thought about how strangely life works. Until a month ago, he'd been a married man living in a routine, unaware of the changes to come. Now he was almost divorced, a potential millionaire and sitting down to dinner with a woman who made his heart beat faster. But the amazing thing was that he felt no bitterness. The pain of Cecilia's betrayal was still there, somewhere deep, but it no longer defined his mood and thoughts. For the first time in a long time, Marshall felt alive and full of hope for the future. The day the judge officially dissolved his marriage to Cecilia, he received another piece of news. Summit Resorts had agreed to a proposed price of $12 million for his lot. Life seemed to be opening a new chapter before him, full of unexpected opportunities. After the divorce, when the dust of the divorce proceedings had settled, Marshall began to see what was happening as a strange, unrealistic comedy of fate. He wandered aimlessly through the rooms of his house, which was now entirely his own, and tried to realize the sudden change in his life. Cecilia's belongings had disappeared from the house. She had taken them a few days before the official divorce. They had exchanged only brief, awkward sentences after the divorce hearing, and Marshall felt a painful mixture of relief and sadness when she turned and walked out of the courthouse on the arm of an elegantly dressed man who was obviously Elliot. It was the end of May, and Marshall's life seemed to be finally beginning to emerge from its torpor phase. For the first few weeks after Cecilia's departure, it had been as if he'd been moving through a fog, mechanically getting up in the morning, going to calls, fixing printers and copiers, coming home and falling asleep to the monotonous muttering of the television. The town of Havenport, where he had lived all his life, now seemed foreign and unfamiliar. But by early summer, something had changed. Perhaps it was the money in the account. The first installment of $6 million from Summit Resorts had already arrived, and the second was expected after the formalities were completed. Or, more likely, Fiona's constant presence in his life. She was so unlike Cecilia, impulsive, with a sharp tongue and an infectious laugh. After their first informal dinner, they'd started seeing each other regularly. "I like the way you smile with the corners of your eyes," Fiona told him during one of their meetings in a seaside park. They were sitting on a bench, eating ice cream and watching kids flying kites. "It's a real smile. A lot of people only smile with their lips, for photos or out of politeness, and your eyes are always involved." Marshall felt himself warming under her attentive gaze. "I never noticed," he admitted. "How do you even see such details?" "Professional habit," Fiona shrugged. "There are a lot of different clients in a law firm. You have to be able to read people, realize when they're being sincere and when they're trying to hide something." "And what do you read in me?" Marshall asked, suddenly interested. Fiona tilted her head to the side, studying his face. "Honesty, kindness, but there's something else too, some indecision, like you're always waiting for permission to be yourself." Her words struck Marshall with their precision. Wasn't that how he'd lived all these years? Always following expectations, first his parents, then Cecilia, his bosses, doing what he should, not what he wanted to do. "You see me too well," he said softly. "It's a little intimidating." "Don't be afraid," Fiona touched his arm lightly. "I'm not using it against you. It's just, I'm interested in getting to know the real Marshall Hargrove, the one you could be if you weren't afraid of disappointing others." That conversation was a turning point. Marshall began to realize that with Cecilia's departure, he had lost not only his wife, but also the need to constantly meet other people's expectations. For the first time in years, he felt the freedom to decide for himself how to live his life, and it was both frightening and exciting. When the legal formalities of the sale of the land were completed, Marshall found himself the owner of $12 million. After taxes, he had about $9 million left in his account, a sum that seemed absurdly large to him. Fiona helped him find a financial advisor who designed an investment plan that would provide a steady income without undue risk. "You don't have to work anymore if you don't want to," Fiona remarked as they discussed his financial situation. "You can do anything you want." "That's the problem," Marshall sighed. "I've never really thought about what I really want." "Well, now's your chance to find out," she smiled. After some thought, Marshall decided to take a leave of absence from work, a long one, for 3 months. Fred Palmer, his supervisor, was surprised, but agreed. "You deserve a break, kid," he said, "after everything that's happened." The first thing Marshall did was buy himself a new car, not a luxury sports car, as one might expect from a newly minted millionaire, but the spacious SUV he'd always dreamed of for his rare trips to the mountains. Then he started renovating the house, not out of necessity, but simply because he wanted to make a change, to erase the reminders of his past life. "You know, it's not like I've never been abroad," he told Fiona one day as they painted the living room walls together. "Cecilia and I were always putting it off. Not enough money, not enough time. There were always reasons." "And where would you like to go?" she asked, setting aside her paintbrush. Marshall hesitated. "I've always wanted to see Italy. Rome, Florence, Venice. Wander those ancient streets, taste real pasta, drink wine in some small-town square. Fiona's eyes lit up. I've been to Italy during my studies and exchange semester. It's a magical place. Tell me about it, Marshall asked, and they spent the next 2 hours forgetting about the renovation. Fiona excitedly described the narrow streets of Florence, the majestic Colosseum, the frescoes of the Sistine Chapel, the labyrinth of Venice's canals. She talked about the people, the food, how every corner there breathes history. We should go, Marshall said suddenly. Together. Fiona was silent for half a word, looking at him in surprise. Are you serious? Absolutely, he nodded. I'm on vacation. You seem to have one coming up too. Why not? She looked at him with tenderness and something else that made Marshall's heart beat faster. I'd really like that, she said quietly. They kissed right there in the middle of the unfinished living room, with paint stains on their clothes and hands. And that moment seemed more real to Marshall than all 12 years of his marriage to Cecilia. In the weeks that followed, they immersed themselves in planning the trip. Marshall had never been more enthusiastic about anything. He and Fiona spent hours perusing guidebooks, booking hotels in the small towns of Tuscany, choosing restaurants and museums. Sometimes he'd stop in the middle of it all and just watch Fiona as she talked passionately about the architecture of a cathedral or argued with a travel agent on the phone for the best deal. At times like this, Marshall felt a strange awe. Had this bright, intelligent woman really chosen him? What are you thinking about? Fiona asked him one day, catching his gaze. About how strangely things have turned out, he answered honestly. Until 3 months ago, I was married, repairing printers, and thought my life was set until retirement. Now I'm single, have unexpected money, and you. Fiona walked over and hugged him. Sometimes you have to lose what you thought was stable to gain something real, she said. I know that sounds like a platitude from motivational postcards, but in my case, that's exactly what it was. The divorce was painful, but it forced me to rethink my life, to find a new path. Marshall nodded. I understand. It's just that sometimes I feel like I don't deserve all this. It's like I've gotten someone else's luck by accident. Stop it. Fiona tapped him lightly on the shoulder. You deserve to be happy as much as anyone else. And you know what? You make the choice to be happy yourself. Every day when you decide not to dwell on the past, not to feel sorry for yourself, but to move forward. Marshall hugged her tighter. There was truth in Fiona's words. He did make a choice every day. A choice to live in the present, not the past. A choice to trust again, despite Cecilia's betrayal. A choice to allow himself to be free and find his own way, rather than follow a path laid out by someone else. A week before they left for Italy, Marshall quit his job. The decision came to him suddenly, but he realized it was the right one. Printer repair had never been his passion, just a steady job that paid the bills. Now that the financial constraints were gone, it was time to find out what truly ignited him. I don't know what I'm going to do when I come back, he admitted to Fred Palmer, handing in his resignation letter, but I want to try to find something of my own. Fred, to Marshall's surprise, didn't seem shocked. I'd do the same thing if I were you, he said. Life's too short to spend it doing something you don't enjoy. Find something that makes your eyes light up. That same evening, Marshall told Fiona of his decision. I knew it, she laughed. You've been walking around for a week looking like you're about to make some big announcement. And you know what? I'm proud of you. Really? Marshall marveled. Even though I have no idea where to go next? That's exactly why, Fiona nodded. Because you don't rush to fill the void with anything. You give yourself time to find your true calling. That takes courage. Marshall looked at her gratefully. He would never have taken that risk with Cecilia. She valued stability and planning above all else. But Fiona, she understood him better than he understood himself at times. In the last few days before they left, Marshall signed the last of the paperwork for the land sale and investment allocation, bought new things for the trip, and met with his parents to talk about his plans. To his surprise, his father, always so conservative and cautious, fully supported his decision. "You look happier than you have in years," the elder Hargrove said, clapping his son on the shoulder. "Whatever the reason is, stick with it." Marshall knew there were several reasons: unexpected financial freedom, getting rid of a marriage that had long since become a chore, new opportunities that had opened up. But the main reason was Fiona, the woman who had come into his life at a moment of complete confusion and helped him find a new direction. On the eve of their flight to Italy, they organized a small party for close friends. Fiona, usually so energetic and sociable, suddenly became unusually quiet. When the guests dispersed, Marshall found her in the backyard looking up at the stars. "Is everything okay?" he asked, stepping closer. Fiona turned to him, a slight smile on her face. "More than fine. Just thinking about how weird things have gotten. If someone had told me 6 months ago that I'd be getting ready to go to Italy with Nolan's client—" Marshall laughed. "Sounds like I'm still just a Nolan client." "You know what I mean." Fiona nudged him lightly with her shoulder. "It's just, it all happened so fast. Sometimes I'm afraid it's too good to be true." Marshall put his arm around her shoulders. "I think that sometimes too. But then I remember that bad things happen suddenly. Why shouldn't good things happen the same way?" Fiona rested her head on his shoulder. "Philosopher Marshall Hargrove. I like that version of you." "There are plenty of other versions you haven't seen," he remarked jokingly. "Like Marshall the Traveler or Marshall the Italian food gourmet, for example." "I can't wait to meet them all," Fiona said quietly. They stood under the starry sky, thinking about a future that for the first time in a long time seemed not a daunting unknown, but a field of limitless possibilities. Tomorrow their Italian adventure would begin, the first step into a new, uncharted life. And whatever their path ahead, Marshall knew he would no longer live up to anyone else's expectations. He finally had a chance to be the man he'd always wanted to be, and he wasn't going to let it go. The Italian sunshine was working wonders. In 3 weeks, Marshall and Fiona had traveled half the country, from bustling Rome to the quiet villages of Tuscany, from the labyrinth of Venice's canals to the azure coast of Amalfi. Each day brought new discoveries: the taste of real gelato, the aroma of freshly made pasta, the grandeur of ancient ruins, and the charm of narrow streets winding between ancient houses with terracotta roofs. Marshall had never felt so happy and free. Freed from having to conform to other people's expectations, he was surprised to find himself an adventurer. He and Fiona had gone off the beaten tourist path, lost themselves in the countryside, talked to locals in a mixture of English and sign language, tasted dishes they couldn't pronounce. And by his side was always Fiona, laughing, curious, full of energy. It was in Italy that their relationship became really deep. Shared experiences, long conversations over a bottle of wine under a starry sky, mutual discovery of each other in the minutiae of everyday life. All this created a bond between them that Marshall had never experienced in his marriage to Cecilia. "You know what I realized?" he said to Fiona on their last night in Rome, as they sat in a small restaurant away from the tourist spots. "All my life I thought you had to know exactly where you were going, have a clear plan. And now I'm 37. I have no job, no concrete plans, and I've never been happier." Fiona smiled, her eyes shining in the candlelight. "Sometimes the best plan is no plan. Let life surprise you." They returned to Havenport in early August, tanned, rested, and even more in love with each other. Fiona returned to work at the law firm, but spent almost all of her free time at Marshall's house. He was enjoying his newfound freedom, renovating the house, rediscovering long-forgotten hobbies, thinking about what he wanted to do next. One morning, while going through the mail that had accumulated during their absence, Marshall came across an envelope with the official Summit Resorts logo on it. Inside was an invitation to the groundbreaking ceremony for the new ski resort, which was to be held in 2 weeks. "Look," he showed the invitation to Fiona over breakfast. "Looks like things are finally moving forward." "Are you coming?" she asked, spreading jam on her toast. Marshall hesitated. "I think I will. Still, this place has been a part of my life for years. I'd like to see what it turns into." Fiona nodded. "I'll come with you if you want." On the appointed day, they arrived at the site of the old cabin. Marshall hardly recognized the familiar surroundings. Where once there had been an overgrown forested slope, there was now a wide clearing, construction cranes, and other equipment. The guests were welcomed on a specially equipped platform, where there were tents with a buffet and a podium for performances. As Summit Resorts representatives gave speeches about a new era of tourism and a unique world-class ski area, Marshall looked around at those in attendance. Most were strangers in business suits, investors, local government officials, journalists. But on the periphery of the crowd, he spotted a familiar face, the sight of which made his heart skip a beat. Cecilia. She stood alone, elegant in a light gray suit, watching the scene intently. Noticing Marshall's gaze, she smiled slightly and nodded in greeting. "What's wrong?" Fiona asked quietly, feeling Marshall tense up. "My ex-wife is here," he answered just as quietly. "I don't know what she's doing here." Fiona looked away, following his gaze. "Which one?" "In the gray suit, blonde hair, by the column." Fiona frowned. "That's odd. How did she know about this event?" Marshall shrugged. "I have no idea. Maybe it was in the papers. Anyway, it's a public event." After the formal part, as the guests scattered around the grounds with glasses of champagne, Cecilia approached them. Up close, Marshall noticed that she looked a little drained despite her flawless makeup. "Hi, Marshall," she said with the same demure smile. "It's been a while." "Hi, Cecilia," he replied, trying to keep his tone neutral. "Didn't expect to meet you here." "Yes, I understand." She shifted her gaze to Fiona. "Aren't you going to introduce us?" "Fiona Murphy," Fiona introduced herself, extending her hand. "Pleased to meet you." "Cecilia Barton," the former Mrs. Hargrove replied, shaking Fiona's hand. "I'm Marshall's ex-wife." "I know," Fiona said simply. There was an awkward pause. Marshall suddenly realized the absurdity of the situation. He was standing between his ex-wife and his new lover on the spot where his cabin had once been, now turned into millions of dollars. "May I speak to you alone?" Cecilia asked, breaking the silence. Marshall cast a glance at Fiona, who nodded faintly. "Sure," he said. "Fiona, do you mind?" "Not at all," she replied with a slight smile. "I'm going to go look at the layout of the resort. It's over there in the center tent." When Fiona stepped back, Cecilia suggested, "Let's walk for a while." They moved along the edge of the cleared area, toward a strip of trees that remained untouched. They walked in silence for a while, until Cecilia finally spoke. "So it's true then? About the ski resort, about the money, everything?" Marshall looked at her in surprise. "You knew?" "Found out a while ago." She didn't look at him, focusing her gaze on the horizon. "Elliot." He overheard a conversation in hospital administration. Someone from the Summit investors was being treated there and was bragging about the project. Mentioned that the last piece of land they needed belonged to some techie from Havenport, and he was paid a fortune. "And Elliot realized it was about me," Marshall finished. Cecilia nodded. "I couldn't believe it at first. Uncle Ted's cabin, the same one we were always arguing about." "Ironic," Marshall remarked dryly. They reached a small grove and stopped. Cecilia turned to him, her gaze serious and a little sad. "Marshall, I made a mistake. I realized it right after the divorce, but pride wouldn't let me admit it. And now, Now that you found out about the money, you suddenly think of me. Marshall couldn't contain the bitterness in his voice. Cecilia flinched as if slapped. That's not fair. Yes, I found out about the money, but that's not why I'm here. I would have come anyway. It's over with Elliot. What happened? Marshall asked, feeling oddly detached, as if they were discussing the plot of a movie rather than actual events. He wasn't who I thought he was. Cecilia looked away. A month after our divorce, I found out he had another woman. More accurately, I was the other woman. He had a long-standing relationship with a nurse on the pediatric ward. Marshall felt a prick of sympathy, but it was as if it were muffled, like an echo of long-suffering pain. I'm sorry, he said sincerely. I deserved it, Cecilia grinned bitterly. Betrayed you for a man who turned out to be an even bigger deceiver. She took a step toward him. Marshall, I know I have no right to ask, but maybe we could try again. I've realized I was very wrong about us. We've been together for 12 years. That means something. Marshall stared at the woman in front of him. Beautiful, elegant, familiar to the smallest detail. She had once been the center of his world. He knew her every habit, every wrinkle around her eyes, every intonation of her voice. Until a few months ago, he probably would have jumped at this chance to reclaim the past. But now, looking at Cecilia, he felt nothing but mild nostalgia, like meeting a classmate he'd once been friends with, but had long since lost common interests. 12 years is indeed a long time, he said softly, and I'm grateful for the good times we had. But that's in the past, Cecilia. We've both changed. Because of her? A flicker of jealousy flashed in Cecilia's eyes. That red-haired girl? You were so quick to find a replacement. It's not a replacement, Marshall replied firmly. Fiona is a completely different person, and our relationship is nothing like what it was between us. With her, I feel real. I don't have to pretend or conform to anyone else's expectations. Did you have to with me? Cecilia asked quietly. Marshall sighed. Maybe the problem wasn't you, it was me. I've always tried to be what I should be, a model husband, a reliable worker. But it's only now that I've begun to realize who I really am and what I want out of life. And money had nothing to do with it at all, of course, Cecilia remarked bitterly. Money gave me freedom of choice, Marshall admitted. But it wasn't they that made me happy. It's made new opportunities, new horizons, and, yes, new relationships. Cecilia stared at him for a long moment as if seeing him for the first time. You've changed, she said at last. Before, you would never have spoken so bluntly. I know, Marshall nodded, and it's for the better. They stood in silence, to the rustling of leaves. Somewhere in the distance, the voices of the event's guests could be heard, but here in the grove, it was as if time had stopped. Are you happy? Cecilia suddenly asked. Marshall didn't hesitate for a second. Yes, really happy. Cecilia nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. Then I'm happy for you, she said quietly. Really. They walked back to the ceremony site. Fiona was waiting outside the marquee with the layout, talking to one of the architects on the project. When she saw them, she smiled and waved. She seems like a nice person, Cecilia remarked, and she seems to really care about you. She does, Marshall replied simply. Cecilia held out her hand. Well, I guess I should get going. Good luck to you, Marshall. He shook her hand. You too, Cecilia. She nodded goodbye and headed for the exit of the grounds. Marshall stared after her, feeling a strange sense of finality. It was as if the last thread tying him to the past had finally been severed. When he approached Fiona, she looked at him carefully. Are you all right? More than okay, Marshall replied sincerely. You know, she wanted to come back. Fiona's eyebrows flew upward. Really? And what did you say? That it's in the past, Marshall took her hand, and that I'm happy where I am now. Fiona squeezed his palm tightly. I'm happy too. They stared in silence at the layout of the future resort, where Marshall's old cabin would be replaced by a modern complex with hotels, restaurants, and stores. Symbolic, he thought, that the place of his past was literally being transformed into something entirely new. I have an idea, Marshall said suddenly. Let's not stop at Italy. What do you mean? Fiona looked at him with interest. The world is huge. There are so many places I'd like to see: Japan, New Zealand, Peru, Iceland. Why don't we take a trip around the world, say, for a year? Fiona's eyes lit up. Are you serious? What about my job? You could take a vacation at your own expense, Marshall suggested. Or if you want, quit your job. We have the money. And when we get back, you could always get a new job. Or open your own practice. Or do something completely different. Fiona looked at him with delight and disbelief at the same time. Is that really what you want to do? To drop everything and go away for a year? More than anything, Marshall replied seriously. With you. Fiona gustily hugged him, not caring about the dozens of onlookers around her. Yes, she whispered. I want to do this. With you. In that moment, standing on the site of his old cabin in the arms of a woman who saw and accepted the real him, Marshall felt the last shadows of the past finally dissolve. Cecilia, their marriage, the years spent trying to live up to other people's expectations, all of it was just part of the story that had brought him here, to this moment of complete freedom and new possibilities. That evening, they began planning their trip around the world, with the same enthusiasm they had once used to prepare for a trip to Italy, but now on a much larger scale. Laying out a huge map of the world on the living room floor, they marked the places they wanted to visit, discussed itineraries and timelines, argued about priorities, and laughed as they imagined themselves in exotic locales. You know, Marshall said when they finally took a break and settled on the couch with glasses of wine, sometimes I think it's all a dream, that I'll wake up one morning in my old life, next to Cecilia, and go off to fix another printer. Fiona pinched his arm lightly. Not a dream. I'm real. You're real. And our plans are real too. Marshall smiled, pulling her closer. Then I'm the luckiest man alive, and I want you to know it's not about the money. Even if I didn't have a dime, I'd still be happy with you. I know, Fiona replied quietly, but you have to admit, money makes our plans a little easier. They laughed, savoring the moment and anticipating the adventures that lay ahead. It had been a year since the day Marshall and Fiona had started their trip around the world. They had traveled to 4 continents, seen dozens of countries and hundreds of cities. Each month brought new impressions, acquaintances, and discoveries, both of the outside world and of themselves. The first months were spent in Asia, exploring the ancient temples of Japan, wading through the bustling streets of Bangkok, contemplating the dawn over the ancient ruins of Angkor Wat in Cambodia. Then there was Australia with its vast deserts and coral reefs, New Zealand with its stunning mountain scenery. They then crossed the Pacific Ocean and explored South America, from the mysterious Machu Picchu to the bustling carnival in Rio de Janeiro. By the end of the year, they were in Europe, rounding out their round-the-world itinerary. They were now living in a small town on the Greek island of Santorini, in a house with white walls and a blue roof, overlooking the crystal-clear Aegean Sea. It was their last month before returning home, and they had decided to spend it quietly, reflecting on their experiences. Marshall sat on the terrace, sipping a cool lemonade and watching the sunset. The sun was slowly sinking below the horizon, painting the sky and the sea in shades of pink and gold. A year ago, such a landscape would have seemed to him like a picture from a glossy magazine, something inaccessible and unreal. Now, it was part of his everyday life. He had changed a lot in that year, and not just in appearance. Of course, the constant hiking and active lifestyle had made him slimmer and tougher. His skin has acquired a healthy tan, and there is a sparkle in his eyes that was not there before. But the most important changes took place inside. Marshall learned to live in the present moment, not worrying constantly about the future. He discovered abilities he didn't realize he had, a talent for photography that he began to develop while documenting their journey. He discovered an interest in local cultures and languages, an unexpected courage to try new things, whether it was exotic food or extreme sports. Fiona came out onto the terrace with 2 glasses of local wine and settled down beside him. Her red hair had burned out in the sun to an almost golden hue, a scattering of freckles on her nose. "What are you in for?" she asked, holding out her glass to him. "About how my life has changed over the past year," Marshall replied, taking the wine. "Remember how I was when we first met?" Fiona smiled. "I remember. Confused, depressed, but with something in your eyes. Like underneath all the layers of insecurity was a whole other person who was just not being allowed to come out. And now? Now?" She looked at him carefully. "Now that man is finally free, and I like him a lot." Marshall squeezed her hand fondly. "That's because of you. You helped me find myself." "No," Fiona shook her head. "I was just there for you. You found your own way." They sat in cozy silence, watching the last moments of sunset. A light breeze carried the scents of jasmine and sea salt. Somewhere in the distance, music was playing, probably in one of the local taverns. The evening dinner with traditional dances was beginning. "You know," Marshall said after a pause, "I've been thinking about what I'm going to do when we get home." "And decided what?" Fiona asked with interest. "I want to open my own photography studio," he replied. "Not a commercial one, more of a creative studio. I'll do exhibitions, maybe publish a book about our journey. And I also want to organize photo tours for people who want to learn to see beauty in ordinary things." "That sounds wonderful," Fiona smiled. "You'll be a great teacher." "And you? Will you go back to the law firm?" Fiona hesitated. "I don't think so. I loved working with Nolan, but after all we've seen and experienced this year, I want something more meaningful." "Like what?" "I'm thinking about working for a non-profit organization, maybe related to refugee advocacy or helping children in developing countries. Remember that orphanage in Cambodia we visited? I still think about those kids." Marshall nodded. He remembered well that day in a small village near Siem Reap, where they had accidentally stumbled upon an orphanage for children who had lost their parents. Fiona had spent the day playing with the little ones and helping the local volunteers. Seeing her surrounded by children's smiles, glowing with joy and energy, was one of the fondest memories of that year. "I think you'll find your path," he said, "and whatever you choose, I'll support you." "I know," she replied simply. "That's our strength, isn't it? We believe in each other." The next morning, they went to a small cove on the south side of the island that a local fisherman had told them about. "Tourists don't go there," he told them in broken English. "The road is difficult, but the place is the most beautiful on Santorini." The old man wasn't exaggerating. Getting to the cove wasn't easy. The narrow path winded down a steep slope, sometimes almost disappearing among the rocks and bushes. But when they finally reached the bottom, the view was worth the effort. A perfectly round bay with crystal-clear water, surrounded by high cliffs, complete solitude and silence, broken only by the sound of the waves and the cries of seagulls. They spread a blanket on the smooth rocks at the water's edge. Fiona immediately decided to go for a swim, and Marshall pulled out his camera to capture the paradise. As he photographed Fiona floating in the clear water, he suddenly realized that he had never been happier than he was at that moment. Not because he was in a beautiful place or had enough money not to worry about the future, but because he was finally living in harmony with himself. without the constant worry about other people's expectations, without having to pretend to be someone else. When Fiona came out of the water and joined him on the blanket, Marshall shared this thought with her. "You know, I'm just now realizing that I've been afraid to be myself my whole life," he said, looking out at the horizon. "First, I wanted to conform to my parents' expectations, then to Cecilia's, to my bosses, to society. I built my life according to some predetermined template without thinking about what I really wanted." "What do you really want?" Fiona asked, wiping her hair with a towel. Marshall hesitated for a moment. "To live life to the fullest, to try new things, creating something that makes sense at least to myself, and to be with someone who sees and loves the real me, not the version I'm trying to portray." He turned to Fiona. "With you, I can be me. Not perfect, not always confident, sometimes funny or ridiculous, but real." Fiona set aside the towel and took his hand. "That's why I fell in love with you, you know. Behind that mask of model husband and reliable worker, I saw a man with a rich inner world, with dreams and fears, with vulnerability and strength. And everything that's happened this year has only confirmed that I wasn't wrong." Marshall leaned in and kissed her, tenderly and gratefully. As they pulled away from each other, he noticed a fishing boat in the distance moving slowly along the shore. "Look," he pointed at it. "Maybe it's a fisherman we know." Fiona squinted. "It looks like it. Let's wave to him." They stood up and started waving. The fisherman spotted them, raised his oar in greeting and changed course slightly, heading toward the cove. As the boat approached, they recognized the elderly Greek man who had recommended the place to them. He greeted them in his own language and gestured for them to come aboard. "Would you like a ride?" he asked in heavily accented English. "I'll show you the secret caves. It's very beautiful." Marshall looked at Fiona. A year ago, he would have said no, too spontaneous, too risky, too far from the planned route. But now, "Of course," he answered without hesitation. "I'd love to." They packed up and moved into the boat. The old fisherman, whose name was Kostas, turned out to be an excellent guide. He showed them hidden sea caves accessible only from the water, told them local legends associated with different parts of the island, and treated them to homemade wine from a flask. By evening, when they docked back at the small marina, Marshall had a memory card full of new photos and a sense that this random day had come to symbolize his new life, a life in which he was open to the unexpected, ready to get off the beaten path and trust the moment. Back at their rented cabin, they settled down on the terrace with a simple dinner of local produce, olives, goat cheese, fresh bread, and the wine Costas had treated them to. The sun was setting again, coloring the sky with the same magical hues they had admired yesterday. "I think we should get married," Marshall said suddenly, looking up at the sunset. Fiona froze with an olive in her hand. "What?" Marshall turned to her. "I know this is unexpected, and maybe not the most romantic proposal. But over the course of this year, I've realized that I want to spend the rest of my life with you. You showed me what I could be. You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself, and I love you, not as a desperately clinging man afraid of loneliness, but as a free man who consciously chooses to be with you." Tears came to Fiona's eyes. "Marshall, you don't have to answer right now," he added quickly. "This isn't an ultimatum or a repeat of old patterns. It's just, when we get home, when we start building a new life, I want you to know that I see you by my side. Always." Fiona set her plate down and moved closer to him. "I don't need time to think," she said, taking his hands in hers. "My answer is yes, because I love you too, not as a lifeline or a replacement for a past relationship, but as someone I want to share all future adventures with." They hugged under the starry skies of Santorini, thinking about the road that had brought them here and the path yet to come. They returned to Havenport in mid-September. The town seemed both familiar and foreign at the same time, the same streets and buildings, but the look was different. Marshall's house, which they'd rented for the duration of the trip, was once again their refuge, though now they planned to sell it and buy something new, more in keeping with their renewed lives. A lot had changed in the year they'd been away. Construction of the ski resort on the site of Marshall's old cabin was in full swing, with the first phase of the complex set to open for the winter season. Nolan Everett had expanded his law practice and was sympathetic to Fiona's decision not to return to the firm. Marshall's parents, who visited them a week after their return, listened with interest to the stories of the trip and approved of their son's plans to open a photography studio. Marshall didn't know what had happened to Cecilia. She'd moved away from Havenport shortly after their last meeting at the resort's groundbreaking ceremony. Though he sometimes thought of her with a touch of nostalgia, those memories were no longer painful or regretful, just a part of the past that had helped him become the man he was now. One Sunday morning, about a month after his return, Marshall woke up early and walked out to the backyard with a cup of coffee. It was a clear fall day, cool and crisp. The apple trees in the orchard, the same ones under which Cecilia had once told him she was leaving, were now laden with ripe fruit. Marshall sat down on the bench and looked around the garden. Much had changed since that April evening, not only in his life, but in himself. Back then he had been scared, confused, feeling betrayed and abandoned. Now, looking back, he realized that that painful event had been the first step toward true freedom. The front door creaked open and Fiona, wearing a cozy, homemade sweater, stepped out onto the threshold. "Good morning," she said as she approached him. "Why so early?" "Just pondering," Marshall replied, making a space beside him. "About how strangely life works. A year ago, I thought I'd lost everything, and now I realize I'm just starting to really find it." Fiona smiled, settling down next to him. "You know what I've realized this year? That happiness isn't an endpoint to be arrived at. It's an image of a journey." Marshall put his arm around her shoulders. "And I'm glad we're on this journey together." In a quiet garden under the gentle fall sun, they sat dreaming of the future and enjoying the present. Marshall's life had come full circle. He was back where it all began, but he had come back a completely different person. A man who had finally found himself and the freedom to be himself, regardless of circumstances and the expectations of others. And that, perhaps, was his greatest asset, far more valuable than the $12 million from the sale of the old cabin.